Asato ma satgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritam gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you guys. Hope you had a nice break. And good to see some new faces here. The topic today is a crash course in Vedanta. And I'm afraid to say that I'm deliberately making this class and probably the next class, it'll probably have a part 2 at least, a little bit more academic than the previous sessions. But I assume since you're students here at UCLA that it will not be too disconcerting to you. And there's a reason why I'm going to pitch this as more of a kind of an academic class. It's going to be interactive. I'll ask questions. But I think one of the things I find problematic among many Hindus is a lack of rigor and nuance in thinking about our own spiritual traditions. So I'm going to encourage us to bring some rigor into the discussion. And the word Vedanta means so many different things to different Hindus. Vedanta, see, part of the issue is that Hinduism is such a vast religion. It's almost a kind of it's like a superset that contains many religious traditions and spiritual traditions and philosophies within it, you know? And each one is very different. And it somehow contains all of them. Walt Whitman, you know the poet Walt Whitman, he has this great line, I contain multitudes. But Hinduism contains multitudes. That's part of its greatness. But it also makes it kind of bewildering. And as a Hindu, it can be really difficult to kind of digest what's going on, even situating yourself within this vast spiritual tradition called Hinduism. Hi. Grab a seat. So, Vedanta. Why Vedanta? Why not say crash course in Hinduism? Because that would just be too vast in a way. But also because Vedanta is by far the most dominant spiritual tradition within Hinduism. This is not like me as a biased Vedantan saying it, it's just a fact. I'm not saying it's better than other traditions in Hinduism, but it is certainly the dominant philosophical/spiritual tradition within Hinduism. Not the only one. There are others. You'll find tantric traditions throughout India. You'll find different Shaiva traditions. There are also some pockets where there are like even more obscure philosophical schools like Sankhya. Obscure in the sense that even though it's the most ancient school of Indian philosophy, it's not usually practiced anymore. But I lived in an ashrama in India, in Madhupur, Jharkhand, for about a week and a half, in a place called Kapil Mutt. It's one of the only ashramas in the entire world, as far as I'm aware, that actually practices Sankhya philosophy. In general, if you identify as a Hindu, you're some stripe of Vedanta. You're a follower of Vedanta of some sort. In general, is what I find, with some exceptions. So that's why I think it's so important to understand what exactly is Vedanta. So before I get into this, let me ask my first question. If someone were to ask you, what does Vedanta mean? What would you say? Any of you? Anyone want to take a stab at it? I assume some of you have heard of the word Vedanta, right? So among those of you who have heard, what would you say? If a non-Indian friend or non-Hindu asked you, what does Vedanta mean? What would you say? Yeah.
Maybe from your previous discussions, is it acknowledging the fact that you're more than the body?
Okay. Well, first of all, we're cheating a little if you're basing it on my own classes. But what I want is a more naive. Yeah, you're not wrong. It's just Any of you who are coming here for the first time, who have heard the term Vedanta, what do you understand by the term Vedanta?
I've only heard it as like the name Vedānta.
Okay, I see. You mean like a person's name?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's a good name, but yeah.
Vedanta is like based on the Vedas, right? Like that's the philosophy.
Very good. Yeah, exactly. That's a
That's what
good
I
start. I think that's probably the best place to start, actually. So, Wikipedia. You all know Wikipedia. You're all students. If you type in something like Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan, there's this page which says disambiguation, right? And it says, which Michael Jackson are you talking about? The famous pop star, or this one, or that one? You know, there's some actor, I think, named Michael. Oh no, that's Michael Jordan. I guess. Anyway, so the first step in understanding what Vedanta is disambiguity, because it means many different things, depending on who's talking about Vedanta, what text we're talking about, many different things. So let's start by just trying to carefully distinguish what some of the main meanings of Vedanta are. The first one goes back to the Vedas. Etymologically, Veda is composed of two words. What are the two words? Can you guess? The first word is obviously Veda. What's the second word? Veda plus Anta. And in Sanskrit, when an A comes into contact with another A, it just becomes a long A. So then this becomes Vedanta, like that. Okay? So, Veda means our ancient scriptures, the four Vedas, Rig Veda, Yajurveda, and so on. Anta is an interesting word. Any idea what Anta means? Yeah.
Does it mean end?
Yeah, that's one of the meanings, one of the main meanings. But in a more metaphorical sense, it has the meaning of culmination. Okay? So Vedanta means the end or culmination of the Vedas. In what sense? Well, the Vedas themselves are these huge scriptures which are very difficult to decipher. But what followers of Vedanta say is that just as with the Bible has, at least Christians say, there's an Old Testament and then there's New Testament, right? Vedantans say the Vedas are comprised of two parts. I could go to the board again. What are the two parts? Anyone know? This gets a little bit tricky. Karma Kanda and the Jnana Kanda. Karma means, you probably know what karma means, right? Action. So it's the ritualistic portion of the Vedas. Kanda means portion or part. And Jnana means what?
No.
Very good. It's a knowledge portion. Okay, so now, Vedanta is the culminating portion of the Vedas. What is the culminating portion of the Vedas? The Jnana-kanda, the knowledge portion of the Vedas. Which texts in the Vedas comprise the knowledge portion of the Vedas? Anyone? Besides you and you? Or you might know, right? I don't know how much you know. But anyway, anyone know? What are the texts called that that comprise the knowledge portion of the Vedas? I'll give you a big hint here, and then it'll be obvious, I think. Begins with a U. Yeah, see that? Okay. So this is Upanishads. Okay? So the first meaning of Vedanta, the first and primary meaning of Vedanta, is a triple equation. What's the equation? The equation is Vedanta equals the Jnana-kanda of the Vedas, which is the same thing as the Upanishads. The Upanishads are Vedanta in its original sense. What are some Upanishads? Do you know any of the Upanishads, the titles? Kena Upanishad, Katha Upanishad, Isha Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Taittiriya Upanishad. There are many. Chandogya Upanishad. Okay? There are many. All of these are Vedanta in its first and primary sense. Okay? Any questions about that so far? No. Now the thing is, if you ask most Hindus who know something about Vedanta, what they mean by Vedanta, I bet most of the time they're not going to give this as the answer. What many Hindus call Vedanta is, this is what I find, at least on the ground, and I lived in India for 13 years recently. They tend to equate Vedanta with Advaita Vedanta. What does Advaita mean? Yeah.
Is it like it's like a movement of Hinduism now, kind of sprouted?
It's a philosophical tradition within Hinduism.
Like in the 7th century or something?
Yeah. Well, a little earlier than that, yeah, exactly. But what does Advaita mean? You know, what the word? That's also a name of a person's name. Somebody should be able to tell me what Advaita means. Just literally, what does it mean? No one? Dvaita means duality. And then in any Indian language, or usually most Indian languages, what does a do to a word?
Negation.
It makes it the opposite. Even in English, in Latin, right? Atheist. A theist is somebody who believes in God. An atheist is somebody who does not believe in God. So in the same way, the a here becomes non-duality. So many people, when they talk about Vedanta, what they actually mean is the non-dual school of Vedanta. Oh yeah, this is probably not catching, right? Okay, we're okay? Okay. I think this is a serious mistake. And it's a mistake that's been made for centuries, in my opinion. For different reasons, which we're not going to get into. In large part, it's because Advaita Vedanta, this one particular spiritual/philosophical tradition within Vedanta, enjoys tremendous prestige in India and even throughout the world. Anybody who knows something about Indian philosophy, even if in the US or somewhere else, usually what they're talking about is Advaita Vedanta. It's very prestigious culturally, socially. Shankara, who's one of the great codifiers of this tradition, he's considered to have lived in the 8th century, and he wrote great commentaries in Sanskrit on the 3 main Vedantic scriptures. He's extremely popular, to the point where in India, some of you might know, in Omkareshwar. Where's Omkareshwar? Near Indore. Okay.
My mom grew up there.
Your mom grew up there, okay. In Omkareshwar or in Indore?
Indore.
Indore, yeah. So just near Indore is this Omkareshwar. It's a place where many monks go, and it's a very spiritual, holy place with the river. Why am I forgetting the name? I can't believe I forgot the name of the river. That's embarrassing. Anyway, so the government, the Indian government, has invested thousands of crores in this huge project in Omkareshwar, where they're building a 108-foot statue of Shankara. And have you been to Akshardham in Delhi? You've been? Are you? Is your family involved in the Swaminarayan tradition?
That's how I grew
Yeah,
up.
yeah. It's cool, right?
Yeah.
It's like I call it a spiritual amusement park. It's in the water. What do you call it? Like the water fountain waterworks.
I mean, when I was really young.
Oh, you haven't gone in a while. They have this really this really cool thing where they show mythological stories, like
Oh, the
Ramayana.
Sound and Light show.
Sound and Light show.
Something like that.
And it's like through water. It's like a lot of water show. It's really cool. So anyway, I say all this because now the government is sponsoring a similar project based on the life and teachings of Shankara in Omkareshwar. Just to give you a sense of how prestigious Shankara is in India and this tradition of non-dual Vedanta. But the truth is, Non-dual Vedanta is only one of many different schools of Vedanta. Okay? Okay, but so now, I sort of jumped the gun a little bit. So, let me reiterate. The first and primary meaning of Vedanta is the Upanishads themselves. What I skipped was the second meaning, before we get to all the different schools. The second meaning of Vedanta is a little broader. Second meaning of Vedanta is what's called, now I'm running out of space here. So this is number one. Number two is Prasthana Traya. Traya means three. Prasthana means pillars. So the three scriptural pillars of Vedanta. There are three scriptures which comprise Vedanta, according to the second meaning of the term. My hint is the first is one we already know. It's this one, the Upanishads. Can you guess what the two other scriptures are? Or at least guess any one of them. This is probably the most famous scripture within Hinduism. Huh? Good guess. Bhagavad Gita. And yours is actually not completely wrong because Gita is part of which text? Do you know? It's part of the Mahabharata. Yeah. So what they do is the second text, the second pillar of Vedanta is the Bhagavad Gita. And the Gita itself is part of this great epic, the Mahabharata. Okay. This is the second scripture, the second pillar. The third one is more difficult. Anyone want to take a stab at that? Begins with a B. Yeah.
Is it the Bhagavatam?
No. Good guess, but no. Brahma Sutra. Do you know what sutras are? No?
Like stanzas or verses?
Yeah, they are verses. They're extremely succinct verses. Not even verses, like statements. The most famous probably is Yoga Sutra, especially in the West because of yoga and all that. Yoga Sutra. Author is supposed to be Patanjali. And a sutra is a very succinct statement. And it needs a lot of unpacking, basically. So the first sutra and the Yoga Sutra, Atha Yoganusasana, but after that, Yogaschitta Vritti Nirodha. See, that just gives you a take. It's very small, but it conveys a lot of information. Then you need commentators to explain and unpack that sutra. Sutra literally means thread. In Bengali, in modern Indian languages, I think in Hindi too. In Bangla, shuto, it means thread. That's what it comes from. It means these tiny little things that give you a clue into the deeper meaning of a text or an idea. Okay, so Yoga Sutra is the foundational scripture for yoga philosophy. Likewise, Brahma Sutra is one of the three foundational scriptures for Vedanta. Okay? So now we've covered two of the main meanings of the word Vedanta. First and primary meaning? Just review. 5 minutes ago, literally. What's the first meaning of Vedanta?
Non-duality.
Huh?
Non-duality.
No! Come on. Huh?
The combination of the Vedas or the
Yeah, exactly. The triple equation. I even have number one written up there. Come on, guys. Hello? Okay. Vedanta equals Jnanakanda equals Upanishads. Okay? Second meaning of Vedanta is Prasthana Traya, the three scriptural pillars of Vedanta, which are the three texts. Now tell me, one after another. Bam, bam, bam. 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Very good. Wonderful. Now, the thing is, are any of you English majors or comp lit majors or rhetoric or something, nothing textually grounded, any disciplines where you read a lot of texts? Not science textbooks, I mean like... Poli-sci, yeah, I'd say, yeah. See, one of the things that we're taught in humanities subjects is a field called hermeneutics, which means the same text can be interpreted in many different ways. And then there's this question of, well, if that's the case, what's the best way to interpret the text? Whatever the text is. That's a huge question. And it's a huge can of worms. And different people have given different criteria for arriving at the best interpretation of a given text. And of course, these criteria are always up for grabs and they can be controversial. You see? Let me give you a simple example, though. Have any of you studied any of the Gita? A few verses at least? You probably know a few verses, right? Okay. One of the most famous, Yada yada hi dharmasya glani bhavati bharata abhyuttanam adharmasya tadatmanam sujanamaham. Does anyone know what that verse means? Krishna says in chapter 4, whenever there is a decline in righteousness, then?
You'll decide.
Huh?
You'll decide.
Very good, exactly. It's the great verse about avatarhood. God descends in human form for the sake of combating unrighteousness and helping humanity. Where was I going with this? What was I just talking about? Sorry, I just lost my thread. Thank you. So now, that verse. If one were to say, yes, I know what that verse means, it's very simple. It's about Martians. And Martians like to eat cornflakes. Now, you might say, intuitively, that just doesn't seem right. Well, if I'm defending the Martians eating cornflakes interpretation of this verse, I might say, well, then prove it. All texts are open to interpretation, so how do you know that my interpretation is wrong? What would you say? Anyone? As a first stab, look at the meanings of the words. Right? There are no words in that verse which talk about Martians. That's a criterion. Is your interpretation, does your interpretation conform to the meanings of the individual words in the verse that you're interpreting? It's a very simple, it's the most basic level at which, like, one of the criteria is it a faithful interpretation of the individual words that make up that statement or that text? But there are more subtle criteria once you go more deeply. Another criteria, for instance, or criterion, is context. Often, understanding the context of a statement, of a verse in the Gita has 700 verses, right? It's very helpful to know which chapter a verse occurs in, what are the preceding verses in the same chapter, the subsequent verses, and then you can kind of decipher the meaning based on the context. That's another hermeneutic criterion, you see? Are you following what I'm saying? There are different criteria one adopts to defend one interpretation of a text being better, closer to the truth, more accurate than other interpretations. And on those criteria, you can say, this Martians eating cornflakes interpretation of the Yada Yada Idhanmasya verse is not a plausible one. And you can give reasons. Okay? So now we come back to this issue. There's a reason why I went on this detour into hermeneutics. Upanishads are texts. And they're difficult to interpret sometimes. And so is the Bhagavad Gita text. Brahma Sutra, even more difficult text to decipher. You know why? Because remember, it's a sutra form. Now, different sutra texts have different kinds of forms. Yoga Sutra, fortunately, is comprised of sutras, each of which is like grammatically complete in a certain sense. There's a subject and there's a verb. You know, like in English where the dog walks, you know? So you can, like, there's no, you understand that anybody can understand the basic meaning of the sutra usually. In the Yoga Sutra. The Brahma Sutra is another can of worms. Because the sutras are so laconic that they don't even make up grammatically complete sentences. They're really, really difficult to decipher. Sometimes they just, literally, there's just the word cha, which means and. That's a sutra. And you're like, what do I do with that? And so you need commentators to decipher these sutras for you. Okay? Now, here's where we get to the third meaning of the term Vedānta. Okay? In the course of time, many different schools, philosophical traditions of Vedanta emerged. Okay? I'll talk about what these schools are in a moment, and we'll continue in our next class. Each one of these schools of Vedanta, each one of these philosophical schools claims to be giving the faithful and accurate interpretation of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutra. All of these schools accept these three texts as foundational. They'll say, yes, these are the authoritative texts. But we interpret these texts in this way. And then another school will come along and say, that's stupid. Actually, you should interpret the text in these ways, in this way, in our way. Every single sub-school within Vedanta is claiming these three texts as their own and disagreeing with the interpretations of the other schools of Vedanta. Okay? So now, any of these different philosophical schools of Vedanta has an equal right to be called Vedanta. Do you follow? What are some of these schools? The most famous one is Advaita Vedanta. I already told you that. I'm going to start erasing here. Okay. Advaita Vedanta, we could say, is the first school. But there are others. There's Vishishta Advaita Vedanta. Which is the school of, Vishishta means qualified. And Advaita is the same Advaita from this, which means non-duality. So it's a school of qualified non-dualism. Now, what exactly that means, we'll get to. But one thing that's key is, many of the other schools of Vedanta are what are called Bhakti schools. Does anyone know what Bhakti means?
Devotion.
Very good. Good, that was fast. So Bhakti, we're all born bhaktas. So Bhakti means devotion toward what? Or whom?
God.
Huh?
God.
Very good, God. And God is understood as personal. What do I mean by personal? We talked about this in the previous class. I don't mean literally inhabiting a physical body, because that would be avatara. I don't just mean avatara. But God understood as the personal God means the supreme being, a supreme person with a capital P, who listens to our prayers, for instance, who creates, preserves, and destroys this world, who will respond to our prayers, who can bestow grace on us. These are all attributes of a person in the supreme. Do you see what I mean? He loves us, cares for us, right? Okay, so many of the other schools of Vedanta, not Advaita Vedanta, but many of the other schools are considered to be Bhakti schools of Vedanta. And one of them is Vishishta Advaita Vedanta. And the founder of the school is, anyone know? Any South Indians here? Tamil Nadu. This person is from Tamil Nadu. The great Acharya. Want to take one guess? No.
No.
Okay, you prefer not to guess. Ramanuja. Sorry, my handwriting is off. Okay. Ramanuja. Ramanuja. Okay? Alright, that's the second school. And then there's Dvaita Vedanta, also a Bhakti school of Vedanta. What do you think Dvaita means? I already kind of told you. Yeah, somebody said it. Dualism, right? Exactly. So this is dualistic Vedanta. The founder of this school is Madhva. Medhva. Okay? Madhva. Any questions so far? I'm just giving you a kind of topography, kind of a landscape of Vedanta and the different schools within Vedanta. No questions yet? Okay, there are a few more schools, and I don't want to overwhelm you. But for instance, some of you are familiar with ISKCON, right? International Society for Krishna Consciousness. That's based on a different tradition of Vedanta called Achintya Vedānta Vedanta. Achintya means unthinkable. Does anyone know what Bheda means? B-H-E-D-A? No? It means difference. So what do you think Abheda means? I already gave you the hint before. What does A do to a word? It reverses the meaning, yeah. So it means non-difference. So this is a school which propounds the unthinkable difference and non-difference of what? We'll get to that. But of God, understood as Krishna, and this world, for instance. In some sense, God is non-different, Krishna is non-different from this world. In some sense, Krishna is different from this world. In another sense, you know? So that's the paradox. Likewise, in one sense, Krishna is non-different from us as individual souls. In another sense, Krishna is different from each of us as individual souls. Okay? And there are other schools of Bheda, Vedanta. See, Bheda is like, it's actually comprised of two words, Bheda and Abheda. That's what might have confused you. Bheda plus Abheda becomes Bheda. Difference and non-difference. Okay? Okay, so this is just giving you a flavor. There are actually other schools as well. But I want to, in the next few classes, probably at least one more class, maybe even two, I don't know. So a crash course in Vedanta in 3 parts possibly. I want to discuss 3 things. Okay. The main purpose of today's class is to emphasize that Vedanta has many different meanings. And 3 different people who are talking about Vedanta may understand by Vedanta very different things. One person might mean the Upanishads by it, one person might mean Advaita Vedanta, another person might mean Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra, another one might mean Achintya Bheda Vedanta. So it's genuinely confusing. And I think it's really important to just get clear on what you mean when you talk about Vedanta, what other people mean. If you're having a conversation with someone about Vedanta, the first question asked is, what do you mean by Vedanta? And then let them answer. Which one of these 3, does it fall under? And within number 3, so primary meaning of Vedanta is Upanishads. Secondary meaning is Prasthana Traya, the 3 scriptural pillars of Vedanta, which is Upanishads plus Bhagavad Gita plus Brahma Sutra. The third meaning is any one of the many philosophical schools within the tradition of Vedanta. All of which take this Prasthana Traya, these 3 scriptures, to be foundational. But each of them is giving a different interpretation of the text. The Upanishads talk all the time about Brahman, for instance. Brahman means ultimate reality. You must know that, right? The problem is, Brahman itself has been interpreted in many different ways by these different schools. So the Bhakti schools of Vedanta interpret Brahman as the personal God. Achintya Veda says it's Krishna. Ramanuja and Madhva say Brahman is Vishnu, Narayana. Advaita Vedanta says all of you are hopelessly wrong. Wrong. We accept God. Oh, you're Krishna, you're Vishnu, but they're not ultimately real. They have empirical reality so long as we're ignorant of the true nature of Brahman, which is non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness, which is our very nature. It's a radically different kind of philosophy, which says that even God is not real in some sense. God in the sense that we usually think about God, as that supreme being who listens to our prayers, who creates this world. It says it's all nice as a child's dream, but in the end that has to be transcended. There's a higher truth, which is non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness. Okay, so there have been centuries, over a millennium, of infighting among the different philosophical schools of Vedanta, each saying that I am right and you are wrong. And they're not above name calling. So they're funny Sanskrit words to make fun of each other. One of the favorite sort of terms of criticism to label Advaita Vedantins, like Madhva. Followers of the Dvaita Vedanta school will call Advaita Vedantins Prachanna Bauddhas. It's a real big slap in the face. Prachanna Bauddha. Bauddha means followers of Buddha. Prachanna means crypto, like secret. So it's like the ultimate insult. These Advaita Vedantins who claim to be followers of the Upanishads, these Vedic texts, are actually secret followers of Buddha, who was a heretic and who rejected the Vedas. So that's just one example. But there's a lot of name calling. Shankara, in turn, made fun of Buddha, and he did so in another interesting way. He said, see, look, whatever Buddha may have been, the fact is that within centuries, many different schools of Buddhism emerged. I don't know if you know, have any of you studied Buddhism at all? There are different schools of Buddhism. One is called Yogacara Buddhism, one is Mahayana Buddhism. The Dalai Lama belongs to this Mahayana school. There's Theravada Buddhism. There are others, okay? Shankara says, now, why? Why did so many different competing schools of Buddhism emerge? Either because Buddha was crazy, and he was just saying these things incoherently, and that's why these different schools emerged, or he was malicious and actually actively trying to deceive his followers. And he had these nefarious intentions to create total confusion in the world. And so, yeah, these are just examples of how even within the Vedantic fold, there can be all sorts of nastiness. And fortunately, there was not violence. This is all verbal warfare, we can say, which is better than in some other cases. So now, that's the general overview. And I wanted to highlight, before we get into, so in the next few classes, what I'll do is I'm going to talk about some of the main doctrines of some of these different schools within Vedanta. Okay? But before we get lost in the weeds of what some of the subtle differences are, I think it's important to ask, what do all these schools have in common? What does Advaita Vedanta share with Dvaita Vedanta and Vishtadvaita Vedanta and Achinta Veda Vedanta? So that we have a deeper sense of, in spite of all their disagreements, these are the things that they agree on, okay? So I would say that there are a few things. Number one, all of them believe in the authority of the Prasthana Traya. They believe that the three foundational scriptures are, now everybody should have memorized the three. What are they? And Brahma Sutra, very good, exactly. Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra. But as I said, each of these schools interprets these three scriptures in different ways, but they at least accept them all as authoritative. Second commonality across all of these schools, all Vedantins of all stripes believe that we suffer and we're doomed to transmigrate, to be reborn again and again, so long as we mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex, with the psychophysical complex. It's a mistake to think that we are these physical bodies. It's equally a mistake to think that we are the mind. This is much more shocking, especially to Western sensibilities, because of Descartes and other figures who made a sharp split between body and mind. And then you end up with this huge problem called the mind-body problem. Once you've said that the mind is the soul and that the mind can exist separately from the body, then you have this very difficult problem to solve, which is how do the two things connect to each other? Because one is immaterial and non-physical, the other is physical. So how can the non-material connect up with the material? Indian philosophy does not have that problem. Why? Because most Indian philosophies, including Vedanta, take the mind to be a subtle form of matter. Chew on that for a second. This is really kind of a radical idea, especially in a Western context. The mind itself is a subtle form of matter, M-A-T-T-E-R. it's also physical. But while this body is grossly physical, it's a gross form of matter, the mind is just a subtle form of matter. Do you follow? Which in many ways lends itself to modern neuroscience and these kind of, right? Because neuroscience is all about analyzing the brain. And you don't have a mind-body problem if both of them are different forms of matter. Because matter can easily connect up with other matter. Even if one form of matter is gross and the other is subtle. Right? Are you following? So every school of Vedanta says we are not this physical body. We are also not our minds. We are the deeper, eternal Atman. This is a crucial term in the Upanishads and in Vedanta in general. The Atman. Which, again, the term can mean different things in different contexts, but usually it means self. And it's the eternal self. Okay? And so all schools of Vedanta say that we are not the body, we are not the mind, we are eternal souls. If you want to use the word soul, you can use the word soul, as long as you can remove certain connotations that might be attached to the word. But eternal spiritual beings. And we suffer because of an identity crisis, because we mistakenly think that we're the body-mind. And then when the body's in pain, or when we suffer mentally, then we think we suffer. And the realized soul, the enlightened soul, is a person who, even if the body is in tremendous anguish, even if the mind is in terrible suffering, like terrible mental problems like depression and those kinds of things, the enlightened person is the one who, even in the midst of that mental and physical suffering, can take a step back from the body-mind and say, I'm not suffering. It's just the mind that's suffering, which is just one of my instruments. I'm not suffering, it's just I have a knee problem. You see? So you take a step back from your body-mind complex, and you can look at the body-mind complex as a kind of witness. That's a very high spiritual state. This is described in chapter 14 of the Bhagavad Gita, by the way. If you're interested, you can read chapter 14 of the Gita. So, that's the second main commonality across all of the different schools of Vedanta. Okay? None of the Vedantins disagree about this. Okay, actually I'll talk about four commonalities. So I've talked about two so far. Third, okay, maybe I'll put it this way. Okay, third, the Atman in each of us, like your eternal self, they're all different. Or it depends on the school, really. But in any case, there's also, according to all of the Vedantic scriptures, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra, there's an ultimate reality called what? What is ultimate reality called in Vedanta? Parna? Huh? Yeah, very good. Brahman. This is like one of the most important words in Vedanta, Brahman. In general, in all schools, they accept it to mean the ultimate reality. So all of these different schools agree that Brahman is the ultimate reality. The only problem is, these different schools have different understandings of what exactly Brahman is. So, as I said, Achinta Bheda Veda Vedanta, and there are other schools like Vallabha Shuddhadvaita Vedanta, will say that Brahman is Krishna, our beloved Krishna, talked about in the Bhagavata Purana and other texts. Ramanuja and Madhva will say, no, Brahman is Vishnu, Narayana. And Krishna was one incarnation of Vishnu, but Vishnu is Brahman. And Advaita Vedanta says what? What is Brahman according to Advaita Vedanta? Anyone? Aparna should know. You went through Balavihar, right?
Yeah.
So tell me what Brahman, or tell us what Brahman means.
I don't know how to describe it.
Okay, well, that's a good definition from an Advaitic standpoint. Because Yeah, one of the favorite source texts of Advaita Vedantins is this statement, a description of Brahman as neti neti. Does anyone know what neti neti means? Neti neti, it means na iti, which means not this, not this. So it's a clever response, but can you be a little bit more specific?
Oh,
Whoa, you get nervous. Okay.
no, I don't know.
Okay. I think it was right before she walked in, right, that we were talking about. What did I say about Advaita Vedantins when they're debating with the Bhakti schools?
Brahman is like impersonal.
Yes, exactly. Brahman is impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness.
Wait, what do you mean by like dual though?
What do I mean by dual? Dual literally means two.
No, like it difference from a bit.
Yeah. So actually, that's a good question. Dualism doesn't literally mean necessarily that there are only two entities. It just means there's diversity. Like this laptop case is one thing, the table is different from it. There's also a laptop, there's also a human being sitting here, and they're all different. That in a sense is what's called Dvaita or duality. Advaita says that's false. There's an appearance of duality. The laptop case appears to be different from the table. In reality, there's only one reality. What is that reality? Non-dual pure consciousness. And this whole world of apparent diversity is nothing but an illusion. Brahma Satyam, how does that formula end? Nobody knows? Brahma Satyam is a Sanskrit, very famous Sanskrit teaching in the school of Advaita Vedanta. The teaching is Brahma Satyam Jagat Nitya. Brahma means Brahman, ultimate reality, and understood as non-dual pure consciousness. Satya means, I hope you all know what this means, true. That non-dual pure consciousness alone is true. What does Jagat mean? Anyone know?
The world.
Very good, the world. The world is Nitya. What? Wow. What does Nitya mean? Even in Hindi, does anyone know Hindi? What does the word Nitya mean in Hindi?
Like falsehood or myth.
Yeah, even a lie sometimes, yeah. So yeah, it means an illusion in this context. This is a big mess. Okay, all right. So, Mithya, this world of diversity, this world of apparent diversity is an illusion. It's false. That is Advaita Vedanta in a nutshell. Okay? And so all of these different schools of Vedanta are all disagreeing about what is the nature of ultimate reality. What exactly is Brahman? Advaita Vedantins say, simple, Brahman is impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness, and it's the only reality. Bhakti schools of Vedanta say, we respectfully or disrespectfully disagree, and we think you're completely wrong, and we know that Brahman is actually Krishna, or we know that Brahman is actually Vishnu, Narayana, and so on and so forth. So they all disagree with each other. And then there's another question on which they disagree, and I'm going to go into more detail in the next classes. How exactly does Atman relate to Brahman? This is a really important question. And different schools of Vedanta give different answers to this question. And what every school of Vedanta has in common is that there is an intimate relationship between Atman and Brahman. Atman means, again, each of us, apart from the body-mind complex, is a deeper, eternal soul, an individual soul, a spiritual entity. At the same time, we believe that the ultimate reality is Brahman. There's a deep, intimate connection between our nature as eternal souls, as individual selves, and Brahman. But each of these schools explains that relationship in subtly different ways. Advaita Vedanta says Atman is identical to Brahman. Absolute identity. You, as an individual self, are actually identical with non-dual pure consciousness. You, as an individual self, are also identical to the same non-dual pure consciousness. But then you might ask, well, then how are we any different? How are you different from her? Advaita Vedanta says there is no difference. That apparent difference is actually an illusion. You think you're different from her because you haven't realized the highest truth, which is non-dual pure consciousness, which is your true nature. And when you realize that truth, you realize all of this is a dream, it's false. It never existed. It's a very heady kind of spiritual philosophy. But Bhakti schools of Vedanta say, whoa, 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 that's going too far. Hold your horses. Why? Because if we are identical with non-dual pure consciousness, what happens? We can't love God anymore. Love, the relationship of love, surely requires some degree of distinction between lover and beloved. Right? But if you erase that distinction between lover and beloved, what happens? No love. And these are bhakti schools, remember. What does bhakti mean? Devotion or love for God. So in order to maintain love for God, you have to maintain some distinction between lover and beloved. So they have to reject the absolute identity between Atman and Brahman. It's not that you are just identical to God. That's heresy. That's blasphemy. No. And Sri Ramakrishna, one of the great 19th century saints in Bengal, he used to say, Bhaktas love to eat sugar. They don't want to become sugar. You see the difference here? Bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, they don't want to become sugar. They don't want to become one with non-dual pure consciousness. Why? Because then they miss out on that loving relationship with God. So instead they want to eat the sugar. What fun is it to become sugar if you can eat sugar? Because then you can taste the sweetness of sugar. That's the idea. So in order to taste the sweetness of God, you maintain some distinction from God. Right? But just because there's a distinction, that doesn't mean that there's just an absolute gulf. There's still an essential unity. Husband and wife, they're not the same person, but they're intimately connected with each other. Brother and sister, best friends, right? So in that way, Bhakti schools of Vedanta say that Atman is intimately united with Brahman, but is not identical with Brahman. We are not one with Krishna or Vishnu. That would be a kind of blasphemy, and we wouldn't be able to love Krishna. But we are, and then they use different metaphors. We are sparks from the divine fire. We are parts, and God is the whole. There are many different. We are servants of God. We are children of God, and God is a master. God is our loving mother. God is our loving parent. You see what I mean? All of these imply some kind of loving relationship. And an intimate connection, an intimate relationship between Atman and Brahman, but one that does not amount to an absolute identity, which is what's claimed by the Advaita Vedanta school of Vedanta. So this is, I covered a lot of terrain in 1 hour, and I want to give you a chance to ask some questions or express bewilderment or anger or total confusion. Or did this make sense overall? Yeah? Any questions about anything I said? Was that a half hand raise? No. Oh, okay. No, that was also. So no questions. Everything's crystal clear. Next time we have a class and I quiz you on it, you'll be able to faithfully explain what I wrote on the board and what I said. So we're going to go into more details about some of the. Sorry, I'm not done yet. Okay, hold on. Let me finish. 2 more things, and then I'll finish. Did I cover 3 commonalities? Is that 3 commonalities, right? Okay, I want to mention just 2 more commonalities across all these Vedantic schools. 4th commonality. The goal of life is to gain knowledge of ultimate reality, otherwise known as Brahman. Knowledge of Brahman solves all our problems. Now again, the schools will differ on, well, how do we know Brahman? What's the path leading to knowledge of Brahman? And different schools of Vedanta will give different answers depending on how they understand the nature of Brahman. We'll see this in more detail later in the next class. But Shankara, because he understands Brahman to be non-dual and impersonal pure consciousness, will privilege one spiritual practice over all the others. One yoga. Not yoga in the sense of downward dog. Yoga in the sense of yoga in its etymological meaning. Does anyone know what yoga is in its etymological meaning? Anyone?
To connect.
Very good, exactly. Yoga means connect. Connecting what with what?
Self with the ultimate reality.
Excellent, exactly. Connecting the soul with God, connecting Atman with Brahman. Interestingly, for any of you who are, none of you studied religion, right? Religious studies or anything like that, but the term religion comes from Latin, religio. And what does that mean etymologically? Does anyone know the etymological meaning of religion? Do you know? No.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, link.
Well, yeah. And then what does re mean?
To relink.
Yeah, relink. Relinking what with what?
The individual with God.
Again, the same kind of idea. Strikingly, the Sanskrit term yoga and the English term religion, which goes back to the Latin term religio, mean the same thing etymologically. Religion is that which reconnects, rebinds the soul with God. And I think part of the problem in the West is that religion has gotten all these bad connotations. And everything bad in religion is associated with the word religion. Like what? Fundamentalism, killing, fanaticism, so-called blind faith, institutional religion, all sorts of terrible abuses that are happening in churches across the world and this kind of stuff. That's religion. That's why there's a relatively new movement called SBNR. Anyone know what that stands for?
Spiritual but not religious.
Yeah, good, exactly. Spiritual but not religious. There's a whole movement now. On my flight back to India, from India, I was just in India over break. And a flight attendant was talking to me. If you wear this clothes, you get into interesting conversations. And so it turned out this 25-year-old Mexican woman who had a near-death experience at the age of 14. And since then, she's had this kind of spiritual awakening, and she considers herself spiritual but not religious. And so I was arguing with her, and I said, what do you mean by religion? And then she gave that whole list, fundamentalism, blind faith, and this. I said, actually, if you go back to the etymology of the word, it just means the same thing as yoga. And yoga is spiritual. Yoga is great. She loves yoga. So if you can appreciate what religion is in its essence, I think it won't get such a bad rap, in my opinion. Anyway, that's a kind of a tangent. Okay. What was the original thread that led me to this? This is one of my problems as I go on these. Thank you. So I was on 4, and I explained 4. Oh yeah, so the different yogas. Okay. So in Vedanta, there are different kinds of yoga. Yoga understood as a fundamental spiritual practice that reconnects the soul with ultimate reality. What are the 4 main ones? Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion toward the personal God. Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action. And Raja Yoga, or Dhyana Yoga, there are different terms for it, which means the path of meditation, concentration. Okay? Now, because Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta takes ultimate reality to be impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness, naturally they're going to privilege one of these yogas over the others. Which one do you think they're going to privilege? The path of knowledge. Because they don't believe that the personal God is ultimate, and so Bhakti Yoga can't take us all the way. You see? So we'll get to this in more detail later, but I'm just giving you a sense. Whereas the Bhakti schools of Vedanta will lo and behold say that, no, Bhakti Yoga is the highest path to take you to knowledge of Brahman. Why? Because Brahman is Krishna or Vishnu, it's the personal God. So obviously the path of devotion toward the personal God is the direct path to the highest goal. Okay? Okay. So, but what they have in common is that the goal of life is to gain knowledge of ultimate reality, known as Brahman, through some specific spiritual practices. But exactly what those spiritual practices are differs from school to school. And there's usually a hierarchy of yogas. What do I mean by hierarchy? Higher and lower. Often these schools will say, your yoga is good, but my yoga is better. Your yoga is a stepping stone toward the highest yoga, which is my yoga, which alone leads to knowledge of Brahman. So that your yoga is good, but it's indirect. My yoga is the only direct path. So you see how there's always this hierarchical language in play. You'll find that across all of these traditional schools of Vedanta. So that's the fourth commonality, though. But even though they disagree on what exact spiritual practices take us to knowledge of Brahman, all of them agree that the goal of life is knowledge of Brahman, and that a certain yoga or a combination of yogas will take us to this highest goal. And fourth and final commonality, right? Are we on 4? Yeah. 5. Are we on 5? We're on 5 at this point. I'm getting confused. Okay, we're on 5. Fifth commonality. Knowledge of Brahman is tantamount to liberation. What is the Sanskrit term for liberation? Very good. Moksha or mukti. They mean the same thing. M-U-K-T-I or M-O-K-S-A. Moksha or mukti. Liberation. Liberation from what? This is an interesting question. Liberation. Hindus talk about liberation. Liberation from what? You have to be liberated from something. Yeah, very good. Birth or rebirth. This cycle of birth and death. We keep coming again and again as if trapped in this endless cycle. I live for 80 years, I leave this body, and then after some time I have to take up another body. Hindus believe in karma and rebirth. That's another commonality. There are many other commonalities. One thing that all Hindus believe are these doctrines of karma and rebirth. Rebirth means we'll come back again and again. We'll have a separate class on just rebirth, maybe. That could be fun. Because especially these days, a lot of people think that it's unscientific or stupid or dogmatic. I'm writing a book now on karma and rebirth in Hinduism. It's an academic book that will come out with Cambridge University Press. And so I'm kind of like deeply immersed in these issues. And there are a lot of interesting and sophisticated arguments in support of the doctrines of karma and rebirth. That's another class. Okay. So these are all important things though. So this is all, stay tuned for future classes in this semester. So what all of these schools of Vedanta claim is, it's only by gaining knowledge of Brahman that we can attain liberation from rebirth. It's only when we attain knowledge of ultimate reality that we don't have to come back to this world again and take up another physical body. Okay? And then you might ask, well, okay, that's a kind of negative explanation of what liberation is. It's liberation from a negative thing, a state, like this, all this suffering, rebirth. But what is it in more positive terms? And again, we'll find, this is in the next class, we'll talk about how different schools of Vedanta understand the ultimate state of liberation in different ways. Some believe in eternal heaven, where you dwell in a loving, eternal relationship with your beloved form of the personal God, whether it's Krishna or Vishnu, Jesus for Christians, right? Muslims believe in Jannah, that's the Arabic term for heaven. But Advaita Vedantins say this is all nonsense. Not nonsense. They say that there's no such thing as an eternal heaven. There are places you can dwell for a long time where everything is really hunky-dory, but you can't stay there for an eternity. Eventually you have to merge in non-dual pure consciousness, and that's the highest goal. So they even differ about what exactly liberation looks like. We'll talk about that later. Okay, but these are the 5 main commonalities across the different schools of Vedanta. So that's even more to chew on. And there's more to come. So any questions? No? It's a lot to digest. One thing I could do, because I have a PowerPoint. Would we be able to show a PowerPoint? Or yeah? Next time I'll use the PowerPoint. People will have a little bit, because my handwriting is bad. Although I did write in capital letters, so it's not as bad as it could be. Okay, thank you. Okay, so any questions? Okay, let's wrap it up then. Do you have questions? Okay. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om. All right, thank you guys.